This is the next video in the Historic Ordnance series, and this is something people have been requesting information on for a while. Primarily because they're getting employed in Ukraine in large quantities. And not just by the Russians. The Ukrainians have been employing them in massive quantities since 2014 inside the Donbass regions, launching them against areas that are inhabited by ethnically Russian civilians. But, you know, your Slava Dinaba people, you know, just don't want to admit that. So this video is on the Russian PFM-1 Scatterable mine. Now, some info on this. It was adopted by the Soviet Army and then later transferred over to the Russian Army. Adopted in 1981, production reportedly ceased in 1997. Now, technicals on this. Height is 2.5 inches, roughly. Width, 4 3/4 inches. Thickness at its thickest point is 3/4 of an inch. Weight is 3 ounces, of which 1.3 ounces is the explosive filler, which is in this area of the mine right here. It is VS6D, a liquid explosive compound. Now, there's lots of safety warnings on this explosive compound that I could find in Russian literature. They said that the liquid is extremely toxic and extremely cancerous, so you do not want to get it inside your body in any way. You do not want to get the liquid on your skin at any time for any amount of time. It's extremely toxic. Temperature employment range is -40 degrees Fahrenheit to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Below 40 degrees, below zero, the liquid will freeze, and above 122 degrees, it becomes extremely unstable. Sensitivity of the mine, and it's this area right here that is the sensitive section, because this is where the explosive is. It only takes a pressure of 11 to a max of 55 pounds, depending on the temperature. The colder it is, the more weight is needed. The hotter it is, the lower the weight. You only need 11 to 55 pounds of pressure onto this area of the mine to set it off. The shelf life on these reportedly is 10 years. Beyond 10 years, the explosive compound in here has a tendency to breach into the fuse section here in the middle, and it makes them more sensitive when handled. These mines are reverse engineered from a mine employed by the U.S. military in Vietnam, known as the BLU-43B, which the Russians referred to or codenamed Dragon Tooth. These looked pretty much exactly like this, similar fusing. The Russians went through, did some improvements on it, they said, and came out with their own version, but it is essentially a direct copy. These can be deployed using mechanical mine layers, because these are fired out of canisters. They also can be delivered by aircraft. Just an idea, a Sukhoi 25 carrying a load of canisters loaded with PFM-1s can deploy up to 7,488 mines off that one aircraft. They can also be delivered by helicopters. They can also be delivered by long-range rockets. The BM-21 series MLRS, in each canister or each rocket can deliver up to 612 mines. I also came across a picture that there was a deployment system created for the soldier on the ground. It was kind of a backpack with the canister on it. They put it out, deployed a bipod on it, hooked up their firing device to it, set it off, and then the canister expelled the rounds out, covering the area. Sort of along the lines of US MOPMs. It was a similar concept. The soldiers take them in to cover those small areas in a minefield to close off the gaps between minefields that your forces use for moving through, to get your cavalry screen from in front of your obstacles through your defenses to the back. And then after that screen is through, you're supposed to close off those lanes. We would do it with MOPMs. The Russians came up with their own version using this. These mines reportedly arm after they hit the ground, and depending on temperature can take 1 minute to a max of 10 minutes to arm. Now, how these arm, this striker right here, when it's being transported, is down inside the body here, and you can't really see it on the replica too well, but there's a notch right here that goes through to the other side of the opening here. Well, over this, to keep that striker in, that plunger in, there's a small safety clip. That safety clip is connected to the canister. When the canister is fired, the mine is ejected, that safety clip is removed and stays with the canister. Now, there are stories, which I cannot confirm, but there are stories of Russian reconnaissance troops, and especially their Spetsnaz, their Special Operations Reconnaissance troops, hand deploying these behind them. How they did that, I can't find out. I've looked it up and I cannot find anything in Russian literature that mentions them doing it. But it is mentioned by the Mujahideen in their stuff that they wrote up after the war, that Russian troops would sometimes do that. I don't know if they had their engineers go through, tear apart one of those canisters level by level and made sure that the safety clip stayed in here, and then gave it to their troops to deploy, and they would just pull the clip and toss it behind them. Or if they just yanked them out of the canister and then kept them in a pouch on them somewhere to just toss them out behind them, and they were armed inside the pouch. With how the Soviet Army was back in those days, it could be either way. It really could. I just cannot find corroboration from Russian websites that they actually did that, though, in Afghanistan. Now, some nicknames for this mine. It is known as the butterfly mine, which is what we referred to it as when I was on active duty in the military here in the U.S. It's also referred to as the bird mine. In Afghanistan, they called it the green parrot. And in Ukraine, they refer to it as the petal or petal mine. If it's mentioned in the media, they only use the Ukrainian term for these mines. Now, there are two types of mines in the PFM family. You have the straight PFM-1, which does not have a self-destruct on it. So once it's out there till either the reservoir here bursts and the explosive leaks out, or something steps on it, sets it off, or it starts on fire and burns up, whatever. There's also a PFM-1S, and the only way you can tell the difference between a 1 and a 1S is on the thinner wing here. There's supposed to be a small C inscribed in here, like you see the markings that are in here that are simulated on this one. There's going to be a small C that denotes it's a 1S. The difference between the 1 and the 1S is the 1S does have a self-destruct on it. They are designed to go off once they receive the correct, impulse, the instruction to tell them when to detonate. They're supposed to detonate between 1 hour and 40 hours after deployment. Duration on the ground. A PFM-1 under average conditions will last out on the ground for about 1 year before it starts to fail. On the PFM-1S, when it reaches that time limit that it's supposed to self-destruct, reportedly, on average, 85% of the mines self-destruct. 15% or up to 15%, for some reason, the self-destruct mechanism inside there does not work correctly. This could be because of age, because the last ones produced were in 1997. Now, reportedly, Russia themselves went through, starting in 1997, and destroyed all of their PFM-1s. They only left in service the PFM-1S. So they kept it, the ones that have the self-destruct. And they did that to conform to the Ottawa Landmine Ban Treaty. They could only maintain them if they would self-destruct. Now, the ones that Ukraine is deploying are primarily the PFM-1s without the self-destruct. The Russians are deploying the ones that have the self-destruct in them. Just checking on some more. Okay, covered the technicals. Ooh. The only colors that these were produced in were green and also khaki brown. And these reportedly were mixed inside the canisters. At least the ones that the Russians talked about on their sapper websites, is they were mixed inside the canisters. You had some brown ones in there. You had mostly green ones. The ones that went to Afghanistan were mostly packed with the brown ones. All right, demining on this. When you read through on the Russian manuals, they said they are recoverable. The soldier can come through, pick them up, and reuse them. However, remember that 10-year shelf life. The last run came off the production line in 1997. So current Russian military engineers tell their people, do not attempt to recover these mines. And they would recover them for proper disposal, not just reuse. Now, some of the techniques that have been created for disposing of the PFM-1s after they deploy. First is crushing them under mine rollers or under the treads of tanks. They said in Ukraine, do not use BMPs, only tanks, because apparently a few hits from these on the tracks on the BMP will break the track in the middle of a minefield, which is not good. You can shoot at them, but it must have a decent sized bullet, so 5.45 and above. And when you're shooting at it, you want to target this area here. Either puncture the reservoir to leak the explosive out, or hit the fuse to set it off, or just plain launch the fuse directly out of the body. You can burn them. Set fire to the grass and brush that these fell in. These mines, because they are made out of plastic, will burn. Okay, hand removal. Not recommended, but it is being done, especially in civilian areas in the Donbass, by Russian engineers. The quickest way is to take a long handle shovel, slip the shovel up, starting underneath the thin pedal here, get it up on the shovel, get the shovel up under the fuse, hopefully all the way under, pick it up, and as gently as possible, move it over to an area for disposal. And the Russian sappers say when they do that, you need to be in a crouching position so that if it does go off, it cuts down on how much can hit you. Now, there is another method that is being employed which is a little bit safer than using a metal-headed shovel to do it. A technique that they came up with is to take a water bottle, cut it in half at an angle to turn it into a scoop. And the water bottles that they're using are the big 1 liter ones. You then take your improvised scoop, attach it onto a long pole. The pole is at least 10 feet in length. Tape it onto the end. Then they go through, do the same thing, crouch, slip it up under here, try to get this into the bottle, then lift it up, transport it to an area for disposal. And the Russian sappers note when you do that, do not pick up any stones with it because that's shrapnel. If this blows up inside the plastic scoop, you just got to deal with the blast effects. There's no metal in here except the fuse. Now you can set these off by tossing rocks at them, but it's highly not recommended because the rocks, when it sets this thing off, become shrapnel, which can come right back at you. But they did say in an emergency situation, like you're trying to get out of a minefield that was dropped right over the top of you, you're starting to get enemy fire, you can use rocks and weapons fire to get out of the minefield. Now, the final thing I'm going to cover on this is why this shape and this design. Well, first off, this is a direct copy of the U.S. Scatterable mine, as the Russians call it, the Dragon's Tooth. But reading through the Russian literature, Russian military engineers are furious with claims in the West that this was deliberately designed to look like a toy for children to pick up. And they said that's not what was intended. They said the reason it is this shape is when it comes out of the canister in the air, this thing essentially acts like a seed coming out of a maple tree. It will come down and it'll spin, stabilizing it as it hits the ground. It cuts down on it on the speed of it coming down so it doesn't hit so hard that it sets the mine off right away. That is why it has the wing shape on it like this. There is a story from the 1980s that the Soviet troops were deploying mines that looked like toys to deliberately target Afghan children. Well, the Russian engineers that served in Afghanistan really are pissed about that and still comment about that even today on the internet from what I was reading the past week. They said they never created a mine, hit a mine in a toy, and left it out for kids. And what they think it was some of these. Afghan kids would see these on the ground. Kids being kids, they would get curious. They would come up, pick it up, play with it a little. You know, they're not squeezing on this part. They're playing with it. It's like, hey, I can use this as a toy. I can use it as a frisbee or whatever. Throw it around. And somewhere in that process, the pressure cumulative fuse in here would go off. Now, when reporters from the West heard these stories, that's when they started putting in the news in Europe and the United States that the Russians were deploying mines that looked like toys to lure kids. So, this final one I'm going to mention here. This marking, you see the big Y on this? That shows it is a trainer. The live ones do not have that. It is solid all the way across with just the inscription on it saying the type of mine, where it came from, and so forth. If you have this big Y cut inside one of these, it is a training mine. So that's the information I got for you. These are a scatterable mine. It is a scat mine designed to be fired in. You're not supposed to go out and emplace them by hand. People have asked me questions on, well, how do we remove these? How do we disarm them? You can't. The one Russian sapper said that the only real way to disarm this is to somehow get the fuse out, but you're not going to get it out because of the retaining band on here. The only time that that retaining band breaks is if the mine explodes or someone is shooting at it and then happens to hit this section of the mine. Then you can launch that fuse right out the end. So if you're dealing with any military that was supplied by the Soviets or the Russians, you find these on the ground. There is no clip over the top. Leave these alone. Mark the area, notify the nearest sapper unit, the nearest engineer unit, or the nearest deminers. And you're not going to know, is that mine one without a self-destruct, or does it have a self-destruct? Do not approach these. Do not pick them up. Leave that only for the engineers, only for the deminers. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essayons.